the amazing things to me is how life just rushes along. How things happen so quickly, how events change. It's unsettling that things move along so quickly. You think you have your feet on the ground, and then something else comes along, and you've got to sort of readjust some little place of your inside, your brain, to readjust to the new reality. About 10 days ago, the Pope issued his statement on the environment, which was a magnificent statement. It was an utter prophetic word from a person who is more of a prophet than we have had in that position in a very long time. And so the whole environmental issue is changed into a new light. There is this voice now holding up the reality of scientific evidence next to the gospel and saying these have to do with one another. And the day after the Pope released that statement, or maybe it was 2 days later, a young man went into that church in South Carolina and went to a prayer meeting and then killed Reverend Clementa Pinckney and 8 others. And then 2 days after that, the Supreme Court decided that universal health care could really be a dream in this land that might come into being. And then the day after that, the Confederate flags in the states of the South began coming down. And then the day after that, the Supreme Court decided that gays could get married in the whole country. And about 2 days after that, the Episcopal Church elected a new presiding bishop, the first African American to fill that position, following the first woman to fill that position. Life just rushes along, and we tend to think that it rushes along because it's our modern age. And each one of those things is something makes us think, that makes us rethink our place in the world and the fate of the world, the issues of the world. And we think that that's the case because we live in this modern era where communication is so fast and there's news 24 hours a day and there's all this internet connectivity. And to some extent, that's true. We get all that a lot faster. It's in our face a lot faster than it would otherwise be. But if you want to know what it's like to try to adjust to the changes in the world, then imagine yourself as one of the disciples. Because it was only 2 weeks ago that we had that story where Jesus is teaching inside a house and his mother and brothers come and they say, your mother and brother are outside, and he says, who are my mother and brothers? I have a new family. My new family is those who do the work of God. And then he goes to the shore and he begins to teach, and he teaches that whole long chapter of parables. So these disciples who've been with him, first of all, they discover that, well, there's a new family and maybe we're part of it. And second of all, they have a whole chapter full of parables to think about that they don't quite get. And then he says, let's go across to the other side and we'll take the good news over there. So they all get in that boat and they go off, and then there's this storm that you heard about last week, and he calms the storm. Imagine those disciples. This is a pretty short time we're talking about here, and he calms the storm, and the disciples say, who is this guy? And they get to the other side, And what's his plan to take this news of the kingdom of God anyway? How's he going to do it? Well, probably he had in mind that he would go to the synagogues in all these villages, because that's what he's already done, and that's what he'll do in the future. So maybe he has a plan that he's going to go across the lake to these other villages and go from synagogue to synagogue. But he's met at the shoreline by this man who is suffering from great illness. He is, they say, possessed by demons. He's a man torn apart from his true self, and they've had to lock him up because he's a wild man and keep him among the tombs. And the spirit within him comes out as soon as he hits the shore and says, "What are you doing here, Jesus? Go away." And Jesus drives those spirits into the swine. Swine run into the sea, and the people see this act and they are terrified, and they say, "Please, Jesus, go away. Don't come any closer." And the man who is healed, fully healed, says to Jesus, "Can I come with you?" And he says, "No. Go tell people what you know." So there's this whole region called the Decapolis on that side of the Sea of Galilee that becomes converted and hears about the news, the good news of Jesus, not through Jesus himself, but through this man who is so troubled, who is known throughout the land as a wild man, now healed. And Jesus, instead of going into the land to take the message, gets in a boat, and they cross over to the other side. Probably a little south of where he'd been before, but still, word has gotten around, and there's a big crowd that meets him there. So the plan is probably to go to the synagogue and preach. But as soon as they hit the shore, there's that crowd again. They're all crowding around him, and they want to see him and touch him and hear him. And into that crowd comes Jairus, who is one of the leaders of the synagogue. And he comes up and he throws himself at Jesus' feet. This is a man who is honored in the town because he is a leader of the synagogue. And he throws himself at Jesus' feet and he says, "Jesus, my daughter is almost dead. Come save her." And Jesus just goes with him. He says, "Okay, I'll go with you." And they start off, and then there's the story of the woman who has had this hemorrhage for 12 years. And we're told she's been to many doctors, and she has spent all her money, and nothing has done any good. And she says, "If I just sneak up behind him and just touch his cloak, maybe I can be healed." And she does that. And immediately, Jesus stops his procession to the Jairus' house. He stops and says, "Who touched me?" And the woman comes up in fear and trembling, we're told, and says, "It was me," and tells him the whole story. And he says, "Go your way. Your faith has saved you. Go in peace." And just then, the people come from Jairus' house and they say, "Don't bother the teacher anymore. Your daughter's dead." And Jesus says, "Only have faith. Don't be afraid." And they all go off, and we know the end of the story. He takes a small group in and touches the girl's hand and says, "Talitha kum." She gets up and she walks, and he says, "Give her something to eat." Imagine being one of those disciples. Imagine setting out on what you thought was going to be a journey with him from synagogue to synagogue. And they haven't yet made it to a synagogue in this whole journey. And the kingdom of God has burst in anyway, not in the planned trip, but in the interruptions. It's the annoying people who have interrupted his trip who become the vehicles for the kingdom of God. They never make it to the synagogue. They just keep running into needy people. And the kingdom of God is born again and again and again. To a madman, to a woman who is totally excluded from society and from the religious life of the people, to the prosperous, established leader. Across the board, it's the needy people who come to him of all types, who become the vehicle for the incarnation of the kingdom of God in the world. Imagine trying to be a disciple and wrap your mind all around that. And next week, he's going to keep going on this trip, and he's going to go to his hometown, and he is going to speak in a synagogue, and nobody's going to believe it. It's a wonderful story about how the kingdom of God comes into the world. Not in the ways that you expect or plan or in the teachings. It comes in human need running up against Christ. So that's what the disciples have learned from this. That the kingdom comes when you are touched by human need, and that you cannot let your fear get in the way of letting that kingdom come. Do not fear, he says, only believe, and the kingdom will come. So we who are tossed about in our own lives by events all the time, whose society is tossed about by events day by day by day, what would he say to us? He would say, do not be afraid. Only believe, and the kingdom will be here.